Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to install an aftermarket head unit on a 2002 Lexus IS 300. The process is exactly the same for any first generation Lexus IS 300. This includes the model years from 2001 through 2005. This video is the first part in this series where I'm going to be upgrading all the audio components in my IS 300. First, we're going to be installing the new head unit, followed by replacing all the stock speakers with aftermarket ones, and then connecting everything together. So let's get right into it. Before we get started, it is a good idea to disconnect the negative terminal of the battery. The first thing to do is to disassemble the center console. Keep in mind that the steps shown may differ slightly depending on whether your IS came with navigation or not. If you have the navigation system like mine, pry upwards like this. Removing this cover exposes two Phillips screws holding the navigation unit in. Pull the navigation unit straight backwards until the clips unclip. There's going to be a few electrical connectors that you have to remove from the back, as you can see here. Once you remove them, you can remove the navigation unit and set it aside. The process is even simpler if you don't have navigation in your IS. Using a flathead screwdriver again, you just have to pry upwards on the edge of this cloth piece as shown. This will expose the two flip screws holding the unit in. Remove the screws and then you can pull the unit back just like we did for the navigation unit. Next up are these two 10mm bolts above the climate control unit. At the bottom, pull backwards on this tray until the clips unclip. There will be a few electrical connectors that you have to remove by pushing down on the tab and pulling them off. Don't forget these two 10mm bolts at the bottom as well. Now you can go ahead and pull out the climate control unit along with the radio as shown. You will notice that there is already an aftermarket double-din stereo here. For all intents and purposes, the process of replacing it is exactly the same as a factory stereo. Again, there's going to be a few electrical connectors that you'll have to remove as well. As you can see, the previous owner completely jacked up the factory wiring harness. When I removed the dash to repaint it, I completely replaced the entire factory body wiring harness behind the dash. I always like having the factory setup, and now we have all the factory wiring harnesses and plugs available to use for our aftermarket double-din unit. The next step is to connect the aftermarket double-din unit wiring harness to the factory stereo connectors. The double-din unit we're going to be using is a Sony XAV-AX 1000. To perform a nice clean install without cutting up the factory wiring harness stereo connectors, we'll be using the Metra 70-8113 wiring harness. As you can see, this harness connects directly onto the factory wiring harness for the stereo. On the other side of the harness, these flying leads will give us the various signals that we need for the Sony unit, such as power, accessory, and illumination. Here is a summary of the wiring connections you need to do. The wire colors on the left-hand side correspond to the wiring harness on the Sony unit. The numbers on the right-hand side correspond to the pin numbers on the factory stereo wiring connector. Most of the connections are pretty straightforward, but there are some interesting ones. The light green wire on the Sony unit wiring harness is for the parking brake interlock. Normally this wire has to be connected to the parking brake sensor. It's a safety feature designed so that you don't use the unit while driving. The signal that this cable is looking for is simply a ground, so we're just going to ground that cable. The purple wire with the white stripe is for the reverse trigger for the backup camera. This wire needs to be connected to a source that provides 12 volts when the car is put in reverse. The purpose of this wire is to let the head unit know when to switch its video display to the backup camera video feed. There is also another wire which needs this exact same signal. This is this red wire right next to the yellow RCA cable on the backup camera wiring harness. Since these two wires require the exact same signal, we can just connect them together. An easy way to get this signal is the reverse light in the trunk area, as the light comes on whenever the car is put in reverse. But how do we get this signal all the way from the trunk to these two wires in the front? To do this, we can use the red wire on the other end of the RCA cable. As you can see, there are two red wires, one on either end of the RCA cable. These wires are actually connected together, so whatever voltage I provide at one end will be available at the other. One end of this RCA cable is plugged into the back of the head unit. The other end is routed all the way through the cabin and into the trunk area so we can access the reverse lights. In the backup camera kit that we purchased, this harness is called the power harness. It has two wires, the red and the black. The red wire needs to be connected to the 24-volt reverse taillight signal, and the black wire needs to be connected to chassis ground. If we create a three-way connection between the red wire on the power harness, the reverse light, and the red wire on the RCA cable end that is in the trunk area, then whenever the car is put in reverse, This red wire will transmit the 24-volt signal to the red wire on the other end of the RCA cable, which plugs into the back of the head unit. Since this video is only about installing the head unit and not the backup camera, all you have to do right now is to connect these two wires together. The purple wire with the white stripe on the Sony harness, with the red wire coming out of the RCA cable for the backup camera that plugs into the head unit. As you can see, I've made crimp connections using butt connectors followed by electrical tape to insulate the connections. I've also combined cables that need a common signal. For example, the reverse trigger wire for both the head unit and the backup camera harness. You can just ignore the fact that there is another wire coming out of this connection. You just need to make sure that these two wires are connected together, and that's it. Since the green parking brake interlock wire needs to be grounded as well, I just connected it to the black wire coming off of the double-DIN unit wiring harness. On the other side, I crimped on a ring terminal to get a good solid connection to the chassis ground. There will be some wires on the Metra wiring harness that you don't use, so don't forget to tape them off and cover them up. The only thing left to do is to connect your speaker wire for each of the speakers to the 8 speaker wires coming off of the double-DIN unit wiring harness. In this series, we'll be replacing the factory speakers with our own speakers. So each of the 4 speakers will have their own positive and negative wire. That adds up to a total of 8 wires. Here are the wire colors for each of the speakers. Once you've finished connecting the speaker wire to the Sony unit harness, we can then start routing the wiring harness behind the dash, under it, and into the cabin. You'll notice that I've removed this plastic dash undercover piece over here. You don't have to remove this, but if you want to make routing a little easier, here are the steps to do it. Remove these 2 Phillips screws on the bottom, followed by one on the top near the steering wheel column. Now you can pull outwards on the plastic cover and this will release the clips. There will be a few electrical connectors that you have to remove before you can completely remove the trim piece. You'll also have to release the hood latch cable. To do this, first pull upwards so that the cable releases from its groove as shown. Now you need to rotate the cable by pushing it back and then sliding it out through the space provided like this. To remove the OBD connector from the trim piece, all you have to do is push inwards on these plastic tabs and then push the connector upwards. I couldn't get this on camera as this required 2 hands. Since the speaker wires are the longest, we can start with those. On the left hand side of the dash, I'll be routing the 4 wires for each of the 2 speakers on the left hand side, the front and the rear. As I'm doing, push the wire through the dash and then pull it out from under. Since I want to install the microphone on the headliner above the driver's seat, I'll also be routing the wire through the left hand side. Moving on to the right hand side of the dash, first up are the 4 wires for each of the 2 speakers on the right hand side, the front and the rear. Next up is the other end of the RCA cable for the backup camera. This one needs to be routed all the way through the cabin and up to the backup camera in the trunk. We can now go ahead and connect the Metra wiring harness to the stereo connector on the factory wiring harness. For the chassis ground, you can connect to any bolt that is connected directly to the vehicle's chassis. I'll be using this bolt right next to the shifter since I have everything disassembled, but you could also use any of these 4 bolts that mount the radio and the climate control to the chassis. Remove the bolt, put the ring terminal through it, and then install the bolt to complete the connection. Now we can move on to the next phase, which is setting up the double-DIN unit. From the Scosche dash kit, first install the faceplate around the stereo, and then install the side brackets. The side brackets clip onto the faceplate over here. Once you do that, you can screw in the bolts to secure everything as shown. Repeat the same for the other side as well. Now we can install the climate control unit onto the stereo. As you can see, the climate control unit has little nubs that stick into these holes. Once you line up the nubs with the holes, you can then screw in the bolts to secure everything. Now the entire unit combination is ready to be installed back into the car. Before that, I'm going to quickly show you the connections that we have to make. We need to first install the radio signal cable over here, followed by the backup camera RCA cable, the microphone, and the wiring harness connector over here. And obviously these 2 connectors for the climate control. While you're installing the climate control and the stereo, be very careful around the edges of the dash over here. Here is the unit all mounted up. As you can see, there is quite a bit of space behind the stereo where you can stow away all these wires. The only connection that I couldn't make in the back was the radio signal cable. As you can see, it's just not long enough. I was able to get an extender from AutoZone and this allowed me to make the connection. It just plugs into the male end and provides another male connector that you can plug into the back of the unit. Install the 4 bolts securing the climate control and the stereo to the chassis. This completes the installation of the double DIN stereo. I'm not going to be reinstalling the rest of the stuff around the stereo and the climate control, such as the navigation unit, as I'm working on some other projects that involve that. But the reinstallation process is very simple, and you just have to reverse the steps that I showed in the beginning of this video. In the next few videos in this series, I'll be installing new speakers in the front and the rear, connecting them to the double DIN unit, and finally installing the backup camera. So that brings us to the end of today's video. If you liked it and would like to watch more of my DIY automotive content, don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.